I think it's useful for us to reorient ourselves, geographically speaking. So we were talking about the Empire of the Great Khan. We'd already talked about the Khanate of Central Asia, the Ilkhan Empire, which are both connected to Islamic civilization eventually. We're now going to look at the Khanate of the Golden Horde. And this is the one that lasted the longest time. Right? The others are going to fall relatively quickly or be absorbed. This one will last quite a bit longer, at least a century. And there's various reasons for doing this, or why it lasts longer. And in some ways, it's much more significant because it's the one that actually leads to the rise of a unified state of Russia, right? What will eventually become Russia. So I think it's very important. So we're here talking about the formation of Russia. Russian history is really difficult to kind of talk about, and it's really difficult to fit into a world history class, which is especially unfortunate because of the great importance of Russia in world history. And of course, today, Russia is a major player on the world stage. And one thing that makes it very difficult, and I've had people ask me this, is Russia European or Asian? And my answer is yes and no, or both and neither. Russia's kind of its own thing. And that's one thing that makes it kind of hard to fit in here. It's kind of its own thing, but it's been influenced by lots and lots of different groups. So basically the Russians ethnically would be considered Slavs, and they're in the area that's Russia today, and they originally had kind of a tribal level of organization. But then they're going to be conquered by Vikings, it would seem. And the tribes, after a while, get sick of being ruled by Vikings. Vikings, those guys get everywhere, right? They actually got here. The Vikings also go out to Byzantium. But they're sick of being ruled by the Vikings, so they kick the Vikings out. But then later on, they ask if the Vikings would supply kings for them. So kind of an interesting aspect, right? You've got these guys who, for a while, ruled by kings that are Vikings. Now, I want to stress they don't stay ruled by the Vikings, and it's not like the Vikings have like a really strong unified kingdom, but they are influenced by Northern Europeans, right? And they get their first taste of being a government, of being a state, not from their own group of people, but by foreigners, by these Vikings. Then they will later be, as it is said, taught by the Greeks. And what that means, of course, is a reference to Christianity, right? You'll recall how there is this these missionaries that will go out from Byzantium to try and convert people to Christianity. And one thing that's really interesting is the story about how they became Christian. The story goes that a Russian prince was thinking about adopting a new religion. Thought, there's a bunch of different religions, we're polytheists. We should probably get something, I guess, more modern was the idea. And they looked at the different religions. And the story goes that he was so moved by Orthodox Christianity that the services were like being transported to heaven that he will adopt that religion in 987. Right? And again, that I don't want to doubt this person's sincerity. If you've ever been to an Orthodox service, they are beautiful. He was probably sincerely moved. He found the story of Christianity to be meaningful. But of course, a church that is known for having great ritual and seeming heavenly is going to be a great thing to accept as an emperor or a prince or a king or any kind of monarch if you want to build up your government, because when you can support that church and connect it to your government, it's going to give you legitimacy, right? Oh, the king is good. He supports Christianity, which brings us salvation and brings us this advanced civilization. And of course, it gave them a closer relationship with the Byzantine Empire. But again, I don't want you to think that what's going to become Russia is unified. It's not, at least politically speaking. The Russian people, which are divided among multiple different governments, will share a religion and a civilization, but they will be divided politically. And that makes it relatively easy for the Mongols to conquer them in 1237. Right? There's the Mongol Bantu who conquered them, and this leads to the establishment there of the Golden Horde. Right? So they're going to be conquered, and it's relatively easy to do that because they are divided. Now, I want to stress the Russians don't much like being conquered. Remember, when the Mongols come in, They do a lot of damage. They kill a lot of people. They don't really have a good reason to conquer the Russians. I mean, they don't give a reason. You know, the Russians didn't do anything other than not wanting to be conquered that could be considered an act justifying war. And after they conquer the Russians are forced to pay them a lot of money, a lot of tribute. And you have a similar circumstance with China, in that you're paying for this government, but you don't feel like you're getting anything in return. Remember, the Chinese were kind of like, especially after Kublai Khan died, kind of like, okay, we pay the Mongols money, we pay them taxes. We were ruling ourselves just fine before they came. Why do we keep them around? Let's get rid of them. And the Chinese unified and rebelled. It was more difficult for the Russians to do that because they had not had a history of a unified state like the Chinese did. But the Russians don't like this either. They don't like having to pay tribute to the Mongols. They're not happy about it. They don't like being ruled by the Mongols. So an interesting thing happens. Whereas Russians before these different Russian princes and kingdoms had fought before against each other because and just warred amongst themselves and didn't have a unified state. Now they're looking at each other and like, you know what? We may have our differences, but we don't like these Mongols. And if we want to stop having to pay the Mongols tribute and stop having them as our overlords and become a truly independent people, we need to unify and have our own government. So in a sense, anti-Mongolian sentiment is going to unite the Russians. This desire to be freed from the Mongol yoke will convince Russians to work together. And eventually what will happen is Ivan III, the predecessor to Ivan the so-called Terrible, it's more like Ivan the Magnificent in a sense if you translate it, Ivan III is going to do something very difficult. He's going to pay the Mongols the tribute they want, while kind of carefully and quietly unifying Russia behind him. Right? He's going to very carefully unify Russia behind him. And then, when he gets strong enough, and the Mongols come and say, hey, we want our tribute. Here's the Mongols saying, we want our tribute. And they give him the letter demanding the tribute, the money that he's supposed to pay for them. He tears up the letter and kicks them out. Which is, of course, from the Mongol perspective, is an act of rebellion. So what's going to happen is the Mongols are going to send their army, and he's going to send his army to fight each other. And they meet at a river. And the thing about rivers is, whoever crosses the river is at a big disadvantage. Right? If you try and cross the river, there's only like one point to cross it. You're going to be in like a line, and you're going to be really easy to attack and overwhelm. So river crossings are very dangerous. So neither side wanted to cross the river. And eventually the Mongols just said, well, there's a lot of Russians. If we cross the river, we might lose. So let's just go home. And they just turn around and leave. And so this is a major victory for the Russians, even though the armies didn't actually fight, because Ivan III has said, I'm not going to pay you guys tribute. And they were not able to force him to pay tribute, right? They weren't able to force him to accept them as their overlords. He can do what he wants now. And Russia is basically now independent. And it's now unified. And this allows Ivan III to start calling himself the first Tsar. Now, that is basically the Russian version of Caesar. It comes from Caesar. Remember Julius Caesar? It comes from his name. But it basically means absolute ruler. So he'll become the first Tsar, the first absolute ruler of a unified Russia, which in a sense is built around this resistance against the Mongols. And to give a sense of the growing confidence of the Russians, they are going to call Moscow, their new capital, the Third Rome. They will say the first Rome was the city of Rome that built the Roman Empire. It was defeated, and so the second Rome was Constantinople, but that was taken by the forces of Islam. Remember, that happens in 1453 when the Turks take it over. So that makes Russia the third Rome, the third center of the Roman Empire. So even the Russians consider themselves the heir of the Roman Empire and set to work building up this new, in a sense, unified Russian state based around Orthodox Christian civilization. So a very interesting response, I think, to the Mongols, the development of this new and powerful country.